My name is Paula Harrison and I'm the coordinator at University Centre Telford. Welcome to this evening's lecture by Dr Gavin Ward from the University of Wolverhampton's Sports Department. Thank you ever so much for joining us. I know it's a lovely evening and it's very tempting to stay outside in the sunshine. We do appreciate that you've come inside to join us. As I said, I'm the coordinator at University Centre Telford and we're part of the University of Wolverhampton and we're based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. And we normally have a public lecture programme which is held in the centre, but obviously because of the current pandemic we have had to move our lectures online. And the sports staff have been incredibly supportive and have offered 6 lectures, and Gavin's lecture is the last of these 6, and they've been on a range of sports topics and have all been very well received. Now, just before I hand over to Gavin, I just wanted to explain that there'll be an opportunity at the end of the lecture for some Q&A, and for those of you who've attended before, the button for the Q&A, if you're on a desktop, is at the bottom of the screen, and if you're on a mobile device, it's in the top right-hand corner. So we're delighted to welcome Dr Gavin Ward for his lecture tonight, and the theme is compulsory exercise in school, pupil and teacher eye views. And some of our recordings from our previous lectures, I've forgotten to say, are also available on the University Centre Telford YouTube channel. So Gavin is a senior lecturer in PE at the University of Wolverhampton. He leads the sports cultures and pedagogy research team within the Institute of Sport and Human Sciences. His research interests and recent publications cover physical education, pedagogy, knowledge construction, and socio-cultural investigations in health. So we say a warm welcome to Gavin, and I'll hand over to him now. Thank you very much, Gavin.
Thanks, Paula. Paula, I can't seem to see anybody who's in the meeting here at all. Can that be changed at all?
No, they're just sort of silently sitting.
Okay, all right, okay.
Yes.
All right, so I don't really know who I'm talking to. Okay, so I'll make a start anyway. Then hopefully some questions will come through and we can have some discussion and conversation. So yes, I reiterate, thank you for joining me on this lovely evening and coming inside to listen to me drawl on about compulsory exercise. So in particular, I'm going to look at the Daily Mile Challenge and teacher and pupil perspectives of this exercise intervention. And I'm going to draw in from research that I published in a peer review journal. So that means it's been blind reviewed by experts in the field and published in a journal called Sport Education Society. And I published this with a colleague, Dr Scott, who's now up at Edinburgh. Oh, I've just clicked on the, oh, stop that. Sorry.
Don't worry.
Oh, well, we're in here. Sorry about that. Okay, can you see that okay, Paula?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back. I need to go back to this slide here. Okay, so when we start seeing compulsory exercise in school, there are a number of, or 2 key logical arguments that appear, and they seem to be logical and they seem to be quite simple, and the connections seem to be quite clear. And essentially it's that we have children doing less exercise, spending more time on screens, eating more food, that this is a national problem, and as a consequence we get overweight children and at worst children suffering from obesity. And when we have children who are at risk or who do have who are suffering obesity or who are overweight, the argument is if we burn the calories through an exercise intervention, they're either going to solve the issue, or in later life they won't necessarily suffer from obesity or this risk, or the risk will be lowered. And this is where my interest in compulsory exercise in school comes in, and interventions like the Daily Mile Challenge come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us on a critical. Now, in terms of academic work, when we're critical, we don't just slam anything. What we do is we question, and we question the assumptions behind arguments, and we question the connections between those arguments. And I'm looking at a critical position on the Daily Mile Challenge, which is a form of compulsory exercise. And this sort of research I did, I wanted to consider how compulsory exercise is experienced by pupils, and of course the teachers, who are the subjects of these whole school interventions. And in doing so, I wanted to consider maybe a different position on physical activity and its role in health and well-being. Now, we'll be questioning these logical arguments, and for some of you it might be quite controversial. And the argument is that child obesity is a national issue, that physical activity will burn the calories, and thus the solution is for all pupils to do more exercise in school. Now, I'm not suggesting that child obesity doesn't exist, and I'm not suggesting that physical activity burns calories, and I'm not suggesting that physical activity doesn't play a role in health and well-being. But I'm trying to unpick this common held belief that not necessarily is proved in science. So when we start talking about physical activity, sport and exercise, and physical education in primary school, we start to conflate, and that means we merge together and we see them as the same thing, these categories of physical activities. So physical education becomes the same as physical activity, which becomes the same as sport, which becomes the same as exercise. And we often see this conflation in the beliefs that people profess when they're involved in the teaching and delivery of the subject, often in policy and particularly in practice. Now, for me, I'm a physical educationist. I've been a physical educationist all of my career, and they are different movement cultures or ways and reasons for people give to engage in movement. Okay, and the differences can be identified through the rationales that are provided for children to being tasked to do them, and the context in which they occur, and also the suggested outcomes of these interventions. Now, that doesn't mean that something can be called, or sorry, it does mean that something can be called physical education in name, but actually something else is actually happening when we examine it further. So as an example of this, we've seen Joe Wicks has been broadcasting through YouTube and has been titled The Nation's PE Teacher. And it's an example of this conflation, where we get a very specific form of exercise, and we then have to question what's the educational value here. So how is this unlocking human growth for children? How is offering a different position on exercise? How sustainable is it when we see just copying, and sometimes there's no means to gauge how well children are copying something, so there's very little connection with quality. And also we have to question particularly the self-interest of such interventions, because of course this person's a businessman and makes money out of his broadcasts, but not necessarily these, but others. And so we have to think carefully about conflating these things together. So for me, trying to find exactly the dividing line to them is not very fruitful, but we can see where they overlap, and where we see difference, we can sort of work out what they are. So as an example, in physical education, pupils might create their own forms of exercise to understand what they enjoy about participating in different forms of physical activity. So the educational element here is this empowering students to bring what they know, to experience what other people know, and then to take a position on that. And that creates human growth, because it creates a reflection upon your own and others' enjoyment or takes on physical activity. Another example would be in physical education, pupils might explore the movement culture of rugby. So this is a specialised sport. okay? And in that examination, that specialised sport, they might, for example, look at the relations between the rules and tactical solutions as an educational content, or they might look at the physicality of the game and examine ways to create inclusion between children who want that physicality and children who don't. And I think the key thing that, for me, that makes physical education stand out in these respects is every child has to do it. And that in other contexts, that physical activity take, the sport take, the exercise take, they're not necessarily compulsory. So when we're teaching a subject, you have to realise children have to be there. And there also has to be an educational content of it. We also need to question bodies of experts who thrive off or live off this notion of an obesity epidemic, and who often provide solutions, but necessarily these problems and solutions aren't established in science, and there's no direct link between cause and solutions. And that we have a market economy, particularly now in education, and this creates opportunities for us to profit from offering these solutions. And by subcontracting a problem onto somebody else, we can focus on other things, but we have to be really careful about the rationale for that subcontraction of physical education and exercise. So when we look at some of the arguments and practices behind exercise interventions and behind physical education, we really need to question clearly the rationale. We need to look at the evidence that supports that rationale. And we also really need to explore the outcomes or the experience offered beyond what might seem to be often self-fulfilling evidence to support continuation, such as they enjoyed it, it was great fun, everyone's happy, let's do it again. We need to cut through some of this rhetoric about assumptions around problems and solutions. And for me, this means exploring meanings, exploring experiences, and what this says about the interventions for those people who are required to do them. So let's get on to the Daily Mile Challenge. Some background. It's originated in around 2012 from a school in Stirling in Scotland, a primary school. The head teacher at the time was responding to, I think it was a comment made by a grandparent picking up one of their grandchildren who said that the children looked unfit. The head teacher then acted on this and thought, you know, I'm going to create a space in a school day where children can exercise. It's 15 minutes. And the children were encouraged to move around a particular route around the school. And when they averaged out how far they managed to reach in the 15 minutes, it turned out to be about a mile. And so the Daily Mile was born. It has a catchy title. It's got its own movement, so it's hosted by a sport and physical activity agency, and 50% of Scottish schools now claim to do the Daily Mile. There are 8,500 schools registered on their in their community, and that covers about 150 different countries. So there's a bit of a strong movement behind this, and it seems to have taken off. On the website, the messages are very bold, they're very powerful, and there's lots of emotive use of language. It's endorsed by politicians, it's endorsed by sports administrators and sports celebrities. And essentially, the arguments are obesity is a risk, and all children are vulnerable, and that every child is at risk to this, and therefore we need this emotive call to action. And the solution is to run. And essentially, there's a claim that it actually improves physical and mental well-being, it improves their fitness, and it closes the attainment gap, so between underprivileged and privileged children and their teacher assessments and SAT scores. So in order to understand this bold use of language and very emotive use of language, you need to understand the discourses, the arguments that lie behind childhood obesity. And writers have been writing about and research around childhood obesity since the mid-1980s, and 35 years on, concern still remains. And this is now wrapped in concerns for children's mental health. And essentially the arguments are around the risk that Western industrial lifestyles create for children, and this notion that we have lots more food being eaten, and in order to burn that food, we need to exercise. Now, this is a nice simple argument, and we've seen simple arguments being used that kind of wash over a lot of the complexity that exists. So if we take austerity, for example, the coalition government likened our economy to a household budget, which then if you think of a household budget, borrowing lots of money and in relation to your income, and it exceeds your income is not a good idea. And so this gave the rationale for the argument for slashing public expenditure. And no economist, they don't tend to agree with each other, but no economist would ever agree that our complex economy is like a household budget. It's not. In the same way, this oversimplification of obesity and how to solve it means this argument comes transferred to everybody, and everyone's at risk. And it means that we can have these powerful emotive demands for action without really looking at the complexities of what lie behind obesity. So obesity science is a term given by two writers who've written since 2005 in this area to studies that tend to look at exercise interventions, that look at nutrition interventions around obesity. And there are two main studies that have been completed on the Daily Mile Challenge, one in Stirling, where it originated, and the other in Birmingham. And essentially these studies take baseline measures such as skin fold calipers, body mass index, so they have to measure height and weight, and physical fitness tests, and they compare this with the moderate to vigorous physical activity of the Daily Mile Challenge. And they reported an increase in physical fitness and a decrease in fat mass. And all the authors talk about the small scaleness of their research, to have caution. They don't play down the rhetoric that the Daily Mile Challenge is slow in costs, it's mass participation, it's cheap, it's easy, and therefore is a nationwide solution, and should be used as justification for national policy around children's weight management and bridging attainment gaps. Now here we have a blurring of distinction between evidence and policy, and Thorburns recently just written about the Daily Mile Challenge on this particular issue. And we see a conflation of a localised disease with sweeping claims for national policy based on limited evidence. So the idea of this presentation is not to take on obesity science and analyse it. It's about looking at children's and teachers' experience of an intervention, but we have to understand that obesity science is not neutral. We've seen this in reports now around some of the scientific reporting around COVID, where we've had some scientists claiming that they repeatedly argued that we were only 2 weeks behind the spread of the disease in Europe, and other people were arguing 4 weeks, and the 2-week people were silenced because of the political argument or the desire to delay us going into lockdown. And essentially, obesity science is similar. Science is not neutral, it's political as well, particularly when we have the reporting of results. And when I looked at a lot of the literature, potential cause and risk change depending upon the research studies, use the phagocytic approaches, whether it's nutrition, exercise, and nutrition only. And essentially, Gavin Ward particularly argue that when we have a problem, we need to fix it. In order to fix it, we need funding, so that creates an income stream for research. And also policy makers are wanting to show concern and political concern for what might be national issues. And so we don't necessarily have this purity in researching something and finding a solution. And when we examine childhood obesity, and when I examine the literature around it, it's a real complex function of lived lives, and it's not necessarily linked to an activity. So what we have here is an area where there's lots of short-term interventions. There are long-term studies, but lots of short-term interventions, and incomplete science. These scientists don't necessarily agree on causes and solutions. That said, exercise and whole school exercise interventions are popular, and the Daymar Challenge is one of many. And these come from what we can term pathogenic approaches to health. In other words, they're about treating potential risks or pathogens that could cause damage to the body. So this predominant medicalised view of the body suggests we either need to treat it or need to minimise the risk to health. Now this can narrow our view of the many other resources we draw from. So just looking at the body as a thing to be exercised and disciplined, we miss out the everyday healths that children have and the resource they draw from their friendships, the work they do, the recreation they partake in, the mental skills and attributes they have. And also pathogenic view of health can narrow our view on health being a utopian kind of objective. And whether we have an illness or not, we all have a health right now, and we need to understand what health goes into making up that health. This doesn't mean I'm anti-medical. I mean, if I went into hospital, I want to find someone who's an expert in a pathogenic approach to health. But when we apply these approaches in social health policy, what tends to happen is this narrowness tends to individualize responsibility on the person who's suffering from obesity or has poor health. Otherwise, it's about their bad habits and their bad choices, and this produces bad bodies. And because particularly children can't be entrusted, or parents can't be entrusted, we have to have a blanket enforcement of activity. And in essence, they don't get any decision making or agency in deciding sort of the shape and nature of the physical activity to do. So we have an exercise intervention imposed upon them and their bodies. So you can probably guess here what I'm trying to do is create this tension between complex lived lives of health and narrow medicalised view of avoiding a risk of illness disease. And in essence, running for 15 minutes is a very adult way of viewing the world. I mean, anyone who runs or who's tried to do the couch to 5K realizes that actually running is quite a skillful discipline to try and get a training effect. So if you're fit and you run a lot, we need to use pacing as a skill to try and get a training effect. And this skill has to be learned. You also have to have a long-term view of what you want to achieve. You've got to be disciplined, and you have to learn mental tricks and psychological ways of dealing with the uncomfortableness that running can cause. And essentially, they need to be taught. You can't just magic them from just doing exercise. So essentially, running is actually, if we're not teaching these things, it's about putting adult long-term thinking and a view of the world on children for their best in the long term. And essentially, when we come back to it, physical activity doesn't solve obesity. It's normally used as a short circuit way to try and create a behaviour change, and part of a means to try and reduce weight. So for me, this really raises questions about the purpose and meaning associated with physical activity that children are encouraged to do, particularly in the name of exercise interventions connected to health concerns or obesity. And when I examined the literature, there was so little research that actually took the views of the subjects of these interventions, the people, seriously. The pupils were absent in the research. So I set out to try and take these people's voices seriously. And in social science, you can't just go in and ask opinion and publish that, because these can change. They may not actually be what they think and feel, etc. So what we try to do is we explore meanings behind social process and decisions and actions. And when we do this, it doesn't become opinion, but more reflection of the lives in relation to the social phenomena being explored. So in this sense, it was the reflection of their thoughts and feelings and actions around their compulsory participation in the Daily Mile Challenge. Now, it was a real challenge for me in order to find a position where I could take individual opinions and views of Daily Mile Challenge, but also see a commonality. And often in theory, social theory, we have individual theories or commonality theories. We very rarely bring the two together. So for an example, a psychology would be quite an individualized way of looking at an opinion or a view about something. And so I needed to find a way in which these were mutually constituted together so I could explore them. So whilst children might have different experiences, there would also be a commonality of experience of the Daily Mile Challenge. So what I did is I turned to a social ecological framework. In this sense, it sounds confusing, but bear with me. In this sense, pupils both use their experience. So I bring my experience to a situation to help me have an experience, but also work within that experience. So work within what's happening in that experience to create a new experience. So in that sense, pupils become both produced by the experience, but also producing of experience. Okay, so they're mutual. Now, I turn to a writer in education called John Dewey. He wrote around the 1900s, and he wrote a lot around the mutuality, so this connection between person, people, and environment. How our psychology is linked to our body, which is in turn linked to our environment, which is linked to other bodies and the physical environment as well. And for him, he argued that knowledge essentially is action. Whether I'm reading a book, I'm involved in a social action, or if I'm running around as part of the Daily Mile Challenge, I'm involved in action. And it's the functional coordination of actions that permits our situation being to be intelligible. So when we see a flow of action, something's intelligent. Well, not intelligent, something's intelligible to the people doing it. But when there's interruption, this context becomes unintelligible. And in order then to build functional coordination, the participants have to focus on ends in view. So what I did was to take observations and focus group interviews with both pupils and teacher, and I explored their ends in view with the functional coordination of their actions. And in doing so, we argued in the paper, we could say something around about how teachers and importantly pupils negotiate the Daily Mile Challenge. So that explains the theoretical framework. So what I'm going to do now is show you how I applied that to the data. So my first challenge was to try and understand the commonality experience of the Daily Mile Challenge, so what constituted, what was made up of. And I'm going to read to you very briefly from some observation notes, and this will help explain the slides to come, but also will give you an idea of what this looked like at the time of research, this Daily Mile Challenge looked like at the time of research. So the teacher starts a jog in little strides one way around a patch of grass. Most pupils walk and some jog in the opposite direction. There are no markings of space, it is a patch of wet grass, 50 metres by 40 metres. The teacher stops to talk to the classroom assistant. They then both walk around the opposite directions of the class. They stop and watch the pupils. The teacher offers a well done to those who are jogging as she collects coats from children who are too warm. Some pupils jog about 20 metres, then walk, then jog. Most walk in groups of 2 or 3. The circle of pupils make gets smaller and smaller. Some girls run in small bursts, punctuated by walking. As a teacher resumes walking, she calls periodically, "Very speed, hands out of pockets, do a chicken." Some children pick up their pace and beat their others as wings. The classroom assistant acts as a stationary way marker. "Go behind me," she instructs. Both adults direct the children to make a bigger circle because it's become very small. The teacher looks at her watch and walks back to classroom. Gradually, class notice and follow her. So after initial pilot of the Daily Mile Challenge by a couple of teachers in the school, it was rebranded as the name of the school run. And in essence, this enabled it to gain some malleability, and it could fit in with the teachers' ends in view. Now, a number of the teachers talked about the importance of it to create a break between lessons, and particularly in the afternoon. And some of the pupils talked about the way in which some teachers use it to discipline the pupils. So as a threat to say that they wouldn't go out if they didn't listen, they wouldn't get to the day mark challenge. So essentially, the little definition of space, definition of distance, the speed, the start and the finish, it was quite clear that it wasn't classroom, because classroom's the opposite of that, and it certainly wasn't break time. So children talked about break time being a place where there's lots of negotiation and different directions that this functional coordination action could happen, and children could leave and come at their own time. So it was very different to that. The pupils talked about was time to chat, time to get some fresh air, and as one pupil said, time to wash your hand and get some light. So obviously very different to what's expected in the classroom. So I came to the conclusion this is very much an indeterminate space for both the teachers and the pupils. It was a space of not classroom, not break time, not running, and not a mile, where the when and where of the daily mark challenge goes to a teacher, and this is what constituted daily mark challenge, and the how is negotiated between the pupils and teacher. Now for the teachers, this is about promoting purpose. In other words, looking like the daily mark challenge. This is my first theme of my data. And the pupils, it was taking a moving break. This is my second theme. I'm just going to take you through these now. So the teachers talked about this responsibility, a perceived responsibility to respond to the arguments we talked about, children's health and risk of obesity. And in order to fulfill this, they had to keep the children moving. And children in some way had to respond to the teachers encouraging them to keep moving. Now, a number of, all schools now, particularly in England, get pupil premium funding for physical education and school sport. And this has increased dramatically over the past couple of years with the sugar tax. And for the lead teacher in this initiative, needing the daily mark challenge to look like the daily mark challenge was important to show they were taking the pupil premium funding seriously and doing something to protect the health of pupils. So this is the function of this. So I'm just going to read you an excerpt of data here to explain that. All schools are thinking about it because the sugar tax money that's being put into schools, we've got to justify that we're using that sugar tax money and having impact. We have to find time that children are active for a minimum of 30 minutes a day. So you need to put something in place to ensure that is happening. And this gives you the extra 15 minutes a day. We have to go to show that we need this money as it's only been ring-fenced for a certain amount of time. We need that to be extended. Yes, the daily mark challenge is free. It's just another way that proves we're a school that cares about children's movement and physical activity. So we have a function of a daily mark challenge to justify funding and to try and show that we're taking some of these arguments about children's health seriously. This is also reflecting what the people said. So this child said, you're not allowed to stop completely. So if your lace is untied, you're not allowed to stop for ages. You have to keep going. You can walk, but then Mrs. will like say 3-minute power run, and then we run a bit, and then you can like relax and walk. So for the pupils, what they talked about was taking this moving break away from the classroom. And it had to feature as a break. So some of the teachers did the daily mark challenge at the end of lunchtime, and some of the children really liked that because they got an extra 15 minutes, and also it helped them to refocus themselves and get back into an afternoon at school. And other pupils liked it being done in the middle of the afternoon to help break up the afternoon. But when it didn't feature as a break, we saw really that a daily mile didn't have this function and didn't want to do it. So as this child says, sometimes a teacher asks us just before home time if we want to do it. I don't like doing it then. So in order for it to be intelligible, it had to be a break. Now, the Day March Challenge also features break from the classroom. It's quite an important role that the children saw it had, as this year 4 or 5 focus group reported. We do it in the afternoon. In the morning, we're sort of refreshed from break time and all that, but in the afternoon, you get really tired. We come back in and sit down, and I get in and concentrate a lot more than other people lads. You don't have to run and tire yourself, but when I come back, I feel relaxed. So here we have a function in helping them to break up a longer afternoon, but also to come back and return to their work and feel like they could come back to it and give it more focus. Now, children obviously bring their own experiences to activism. This is an example of a pupil wanting to try and reenact pacing. So he says, it's really tricky to do it non-stop. They, like the teacher said, it's not about going the fastest, but pacing yourselves and keeping going. I sometimes run, but it's jogging like I do with mum and dad. Sometimes I sort of run the long bits and walk or jog the short bits. It like depends. Most people just walk, but I like to try and jog. I want to do athletics and be in a team, so I like to show my good running. So here we had this child trying to use what he knew about running to make it intelligible, but still find that difficult. And it's a child that's engaged with running outside school. So the pacing obviously wasn't being taught at all, and the skillfulness of this activity was just being expected of the pupils. Now, with this notion that children were moving at different speeds, some running and jogging, the children tended to naturally move into pairs or threes, very rarely on their own. And it created this sort of inadvertent structure of sociability. And it was that important that, as this child says, when that wasn't there, it was quite a scary place. And she said, if you had a bad lunchtime, there's no one to walk with. But when you do it, you're all alone. It's sad. You need someone to talk to. So we had this creation of this inadvertent space of particular sociability. So in my conclusions, I argue that when we explore the meanings generated from Day March Challenge, we see different values attributed to it. And for these children, it was about outside time with friends and a break from the classroom were really important health resources. So this Day March Challenge was a really useful health resource to get outside, away from the classroom, and to be with friends and have a moving sociable break. And this is a break away from quite pressurized classrooms with this inadvertently structure with the time and space for them to actually connect with each other, rather than the melee and complexity of break time. So a number of recommendations off the back of this research. So as you probably guessed from the start, we need to really evaluate and consider knee-jerk reactions to common discourse about child obesity, and doing compulsory exercise such as a daily meal intervention, because the feeling about risk of child obesity doesn't necessarily stack up. And actually, when I interviewed the children, they talked a lot about the different healths. And this research really showed some of the different health resources that pupils drew from to support these healths. So they talked about their classroom healths, they talked about their morning healths, their afternoon healths. Some of us adults will recognise that too. Their playground healths, their energetic healths, their friendship healths. And so all these healths create resources from which they draw that create their sense of well-being. And whilst often adults, and particularly with this, a lot of the discourses or arguments that are attached to exercise interventions, it's argued about physical health, about fitness and weight, and the children didn't talk at all about that. It was not about that, but they talked about these other healths that were really important to them. And in this instance, if we're going to make children do particular forms of exercise and such as this, we need to teach them the skills of it in order to provide the key to unlock the door. So we need to teach them about how to pace. We need to teach them the psychological skills. We need to teach them the skills of judging pace, maintaining pace, in order for it to become meaningful to them, intelligent to them as a physical activity with challenges and potential fitness benefits. But really in this school, it's apparent that just permitting greater pupil voice and the type and form focus away from the classroom would have been an ideal opportunity for this to happen, to give some children some ownership about the sorts of things they like doing, they connect with, that they enjoy doing, that are physically active, that are sociable. Some of them might not be sociable, but to provide those different ideas about what they enjoy doing as physical activity away and that's away from classroom work. And really this research for me has helped me understand that there are a number of health resources that children draw from and that create their sense of well-being, and it's researching those further and understanding therefore how we can try and strengthen those resources, but also widen to give them some, a more robust basis. And that's what I'm going to do in the next research project. And that really concludes what I have to say. And here's some extra reading that I drew from for this presentation. And I would now welcome some questions from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gavin. That was really brilliant, very enlightening. We haven't had any questions posted yet, so if anyone wants to have a think about the question now that Gavin is finished, Gavin would be delighted, I'm sure, to answer anything that you've got to ask. In the meantime, Gavin, can I just ask about the involvement of parents in exercise? Is there any evidence that involving parents of primary school children in exercise like the Daily Mile would at all?
Obviously, like obesity and so eating habits, exercise habits start in families. Not necessarily mean that families are to blame when children don't do exercise, but they're highly influential in children. And there is literature that kind of looks at this there are families being a useful way to encourage children to take part in physical activity. But what I'm trying to argue, I suppose, is, as you pointed to, another social environment in which children eat and exercise. That, you know, obesity, physical activity are highly connected to the environments that children live in, the people that they live with, and what they're exposed to, and often. The oversimplification means we just say, well, chuck that at them and that will do it. That will make them fitter. That you know, and other schools have done it. It will work. And what I'm arguing really is we need to sort of stop doing that and look deeper at children's health. You know, a child with obesity has a health, and we need to look at children, where they draw their resources from. How can we strengthen them? How can physical activity become part of those resources? How can physical activity grow some of those resources or add to the base and strengthen them? Because we often look through the world through our eyes, and our adult world is very much contained in different specialisms, different sciences, and we separate things out. And it's not necessarily a lived world, which is a complex world. And I've done some research last year with my own students and their particular experiences of doing gymnastics and dance in the lectures that we do in the modules on our course. And what came forth was a really fascinating way in which students coped with the stress of assessments. And I used the theoretical perspective there. It was about lived experience, and this really opens a world into a view that you wouldn't necessarily find out by having conversations with people. And if you explore these, you realize how people have habits of dealing with things, how they view themselves and what they're capable of doing. And so in this complexity, we can understand what we can do to support students. And this is what I found, how to support them as learners in a higher educational environment. And so the same comes with trying to develop health. It's not looking at health as something that is just physicality or absence of disease. And often when we ask questions about health, that's what people retreat to, because that's often what we talk about. When you ask them about other things, about what makes them happy, what makes them feel good, what they enjoy doing with their time, about what makes them feel strong, what makes them feel worth. This is where we start seeing more things that actually that are health, but we don't ask those questions.
It's giving them a voice, isn't it, and listening to that voice that's important. Yeah. Thank you. Everybody is very shy again tonight. No questions posed at the moment.
Okay.
Another minute or so. Check the chat as well. Nothing.
Oh, I've got a question here. How are developed countries reacting to issue obesity and physical activities? Well, I'd say we're a developed country, and what we've tried to do is we've seen obesity as a disease that can be treated through physical activity. And the simplicity of looking at obesity like that, there are a lot of research papers that have done exercise interventions, just diet interventions, exercise and diet interventions, that have looked at different dosages of physical activity. But the longevity of it, particularly with obese patients, what I've read and my understanding of it is that often weight goes back on, and physical activity adherence to physical activity doesn't necessarily continue. And it's a short-term thing, but it can be used to try and short-circuit behaviour. So it might improve people's sense of well-being by doing exercise, which mean they might think more about the sorts of food and they're putting in their bodies. But it's not the solve all. And in relation to children, it's often being done too. We do things to kids for their long-term benefit. We often think about children as incomplete, and actually they are complete. They're growing. They're becoming. I went to pick up my children from school today, and I saw some children playing in a kind of a local park area, and I thought, oh, look at them, no cares in the world, and I've got all these things going on at work and all these things happening for us. And actually I had to stop myself and say, no, they do have cares of the world. They do have concerns, they do have worries. They're just not overburdened by our same worries, and they don't have the huge responsibilities we have, but they still have responsibilities. They're becoming people. They're not absence of the way we live life. As adults, we forget that. And I think in terms of children, it's when we see them as becoming, we therefore then will respect their opinion and ask them and give them control over what they do, challenge them. I mean, I'm not saying that exercise as the daily mile is not useful. It could be used a really useful tool to pupils examine the physical activity, and why they, about the challenge of continuous activity, and that actually we don't need to run. We can just get as good exercise from and enjoy ourselves and talk to people and feel good about ourselves through walking. It's this simplicity of the link between energy out and food in, and we're going to burn the calories, and that's the solution. That's the kind of simplicity of the argument that I started with at the beginning. It's not as simple as that. There's a lot of other complex things that get in the way that produce obesity.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. That was done. Okay.
Thank you for that question, by the way.
Yes. Welcome. Nothing else coming up at the moment.
Okay.
I think that might be all. I wonder, Gavin, if people could have your email address.
Certainly, yes. So it's very easy. It's Gavin, Gavin, dot Ward, W-A-R-D. So that's Gavin.Ward. And the address of the university is at wlv.ac.uk. That's at wlv.ac.uk. And I'm more than happy to engage in further discussions and support where necessary.
Mm-hmm. So if people are from schools or colleges.
Certainly, yeah, sure.
That's brilliant. Sure. Okay, thank you. And just while you're still there, we've got a few more lectures coming up. Obviously, we've mentioned the 6 in sport, and I'm sure sports staff will do more lectures in the future. We've got a wellbeing and yoga session tomorrow evening, which is on Zoom and can be found on the University Centre Telford website and Facebook page. And then next week, for something completely different, we've got a lecture on voodoo by one of the lecturers from the School of Art. And then coming up, there's also a fake news lecture as well. So obviously everybody is more than welcome to attend those lectures. So just have one last look at the Q&A. So there's nothing there. So I think if we draw it to a close, and I'd say thank you ever so much, Gavin.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Really interesting. I've never thought of the Daily Mile Challenge in those terms. Always thought of it as just good, but I think that was really interesting to view it from different points of view. So thank you very much. That was brilliant. And thank you very much to all of those who've joined us tonight.
Yes. Yeah, thank you too.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.